Welcome to In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson. Join Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible, both from Milligan College, as they bring you their thoughts and knowledge of the study of the Sunday School lesson for the day. Now, here is Dr. Gwaltney.
Welcome back to In the Word. We are really buried in the opening of Paul's letter to the Romans, and it is really an interesting study. We didn't nearly get through with what we had to say last week. We'll hope to try to do better with this Sunday's lesson. So let's get started, Lee.
Good.
And we got to really move to get it all in.
Well, let me just give a brief reminder that Romans was written by Paul from the city of Corinth, late on the third missionary journey, around AD 56.
Okay.
And
why did he write it, do you think?
Well, I think the original idea was that Paul had been planning to move on west toward Rome to visit that great city and the wonderful church and the house churches that were there, because he'd never been there and others had founded that church. But plans have changed, and he feels necessary to go back to Jerusalem to deliver an offering that he had been collecting during the third missionary journey for the poorer Christians back in Jerusalem.
But his intentions were, after having done that, to come to Rome.
Exactly.
You know, it seems to me that he had chosen several bases of operations during his career. Mm-hmm. His first base being Antioch of Syria. And then on the third missionary journey, it's like he moved westward and made Ephesus a sort of a base of operations.
Well, and in between, on the second missionary journey, he spent over a year and a half in
Corinth. Yes.
Yeah. So he had used Antioch, Corinth, and Ephesus as kind of a base.
Now it looks like he wants to use Rome as a new base of operation in hopes of going all the way to Spain.
Launching pad to the western part of the Mediterranean, yeah. And so he wants to write to them and explain that his plans have changed, but his overall plan is intact. But he takes this opportunity to lay out for them his understanding of the fact that we are saved through faith in Jesus Christ. And he has just recently come through Galatia, which is central Turkey, and encountered Christians there. We call them Judaizers. That name wasn't used back then. But Christians there who have a particularly legalistic brand of Judaism in their background that they've brought over with them into Christianity.
And they want to merge Christianity with that.
Yes, they want to insist that in order to be a Christian, Gentiles have to adopt Judaism with all of its keeping of the law, circumcision, the law of Moses.
We need to be clear about that.
You're right. I'm glad you always add that. Circumcision and all those things. And Paul said, no, to insist on those things would undermine the grace of God. It would undermine the cross of Christ. And Paul said, I just can't abide that.
Right.
And so with that on his mind, Paul writes about some of these things. His touch phrase in Romans, as we're going to see, is justification by faith in Jesus Christ. In other words, our relationship with God depends not on what we accomplish in our good works or our keeping of the Mosaic law, but is accomplished by God through the work of Jesus in our behalf.
I think he's going to argue in what we look at today that the best meaning Jew can't really keep all of the law.
That's right. And that's in the background of the passage that we're going to study today. Jews, in spite of their law keeping, just don't measure up.
Nobody can.
Nobody can. Gentiles obviously fall short.
You slip one time and you're done.
Yeah. And the other thing we're going to see in our lesson today is that circumcision, the thing that was so important as a sign of the covenant in the Old Testament, doesn't save. It doesn't save us.
And it doesn't make you able to keep the whole law.
Right. So Paul here is talking, I think, both to Jews and Gentiles and explaining how our relationship to God through Jesus Christ puts us on a different footing than the kind of legalistic footing that some Jews had insisted on, and some even in the early church were insisting
the church really, in the meeting in Jerusalem after the first missionary journey, and before the beginning of the second missionary journey, had settled this issue, or so it seemed. But it didn't die an easy death, the idea that you got to live by the Jewish law.
Yeah. As we know, as Christians, in spite of what we know about the grace of God, legalism hangs on.
Because it's simpler.
It's simpler. It's hard to let go of.
So we're now we're going to explore. Last week we explored what he said and the beginning of his discussion about the universality of sin. And now we're going to continue this discussion in chapter 2.
But the focus is on the Jews in this passage.
Why don't you talk about and kind of summarize the first 16 verses of chapter 2 before we start in reading the text that we have in our printed text?
Well, the first paragraph, the first 11 verses, emphasizes the fact that no one has an excuse. All have sinned. And he's going to reaffirm that in chapter 3.
Well, that becomes his conclusion statement.
It does, yeah. He's already hinting at that at the beginning of chapter 2. You have no excuse. And in verse 10, at the end of that opening paragraph, he says, "Glory and honor and peace is for everyone who does good, the Jew first and also the Greek." God shows no partiality.
Now there's the key word.
That's a key word.
Jew and Greek are the two contrasting components in the church.
And there are two implications of that. One is that God shows no partiality. He doesn't excuse the sin of one group of people, but judge the sin of another. He holds both Jews and Gentiles accountable. So there's no partiality there in terms of judgment.
Nobody's favored over anyone else.
The other side of that is that God doesn't leave anyone out when it comes to salvation either.
Yes.
God shows no partiality there. He's just as willing to allow the benefits of the saving death of Jesus Christ to apply to Jews as well as to Gentiles.
What about verses 12 through 16?
Yeah, well, this is where he reiterates the point that Jews are held accountable and Gentiles are held accountable. They may be held accountable on different bases. In other words, the Jews had the law of Moses, so they will be judged
by the law.
By the law of Moses. The Gentiles did not, but they will still be judged because, as we saw last week, he thinks that even Gentiles should have been able to sense the presence and power of God in the world, and instead they worship creation rather than the Creator.
Right. So all who have sinned without the law, that's in verse 12, will also perish without the law, and all who have sinned under the law will be judged by the law.
Right. And then the verse...
God is able to do this.
Yes. And then the verse right before our printed text, verse 16, is important. "On the day when, according to my gospel, the good news, God, through Jesus Christ, will judge the secret thoughts of all." And there we get to see the universality of God's judgment, but also we're prepared for the universality of God's salvation.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So that gets us now to verse 17.
Good.
And I get to read this long passage.
Okay.
So bear with me, beginning at verse 17, chapter 2 of Romans. "But you, if you call yourself a Jew, if you rely on the law and boast in God, if you know His will and approve of what is superior because you are instructed by the law, if you are convinced that you are a guide for the blind, a light for those who are in the dark, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of little children, because you have in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth, you then who teach others, do you not teach yourself? If you who preach against stealing, do you steal? You who say that people should not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who boast in the law, do you dishonor God by breaking the law? As it is written, God's name is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. Circumcision has value if you observe the law. But if you break the law, you have become as though you had not been circumcised. So then, if those who are not circumcised keep the law's requirements, will they not be regarded as though they were circumcised? The one who is not circumcised physically and yet obeys the law will condemn you who, even though you have the written code and circumcision, are a lawbreaker. A person is not a Jew who is one only outwardly, nor is circumcision merely outward and physical. No, a person is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is circumcision of the heart by the Spirit, not by the written code. Such a person's praise is not from other people, but from God. Now that's getting a little bit complex.
That is, it is. He begins by addressing people who think of themselves as Jews, because many early Christians were Jews. And that word "if" there kind of implies that he knows that they are.
There are two ifs.
Yes,
right?
there are. And this is the if, and I assume it's true. So it's almost like saying, since you call yourself a Jew, since you have a Jewish background, you've got a number of wonderful qualities in your background,
yes,
in your heritage. And he lists them, and it's a wonderful list. You rely on the law, and
yes,
here he means that you,
the law of Moses,
you focus on the law of Moses.
the Torah, and the 5 first books of the Old Testament,
right?
The Genesis through Deuteronomy.
Then he
That's
says,
the law. You
put your boasts in God. That's good. You know God's will. That comes from the study of Scripture.
Yes.
You approve what's superior because you're instructed by the law. In other words, they knew the difference between what was important in life and what was not important in life,
yes,
because the law had taught them this. You're convinced that you're a guide for the blind and a light for those in the darkness.
And in fact, that is a description of Israel in the one of the servant poems in Isaiah.
That's
a
what they
light
were,
to the nation.
They were supposed to be that, weren't they?
Exactly.
Yes. So Paul says, yes, you Jews have a number of advantages. You've been called as the covenant people to do a lot of wonderful things, to know the law, to share the law, to guide the lost. The problem is you yourselves have not lived up to the law and taken advantage of the benefits that God has given you as the covenant people.
Well, and this is very embarrassing when he gets to asking these very pointed questions.
Yeah.
And what he's really coming around the barn to say to them, you're a bunch of hypocrites.
Right. Which was the point that Jesus made to the Pharisees so often.
Yes.
It's not that what they believed was so wrong,
or what they taught.
or what they taught was wrong.
They didn't live by it.
They didn't live up to it. Yeah.
Well, and this is going to be one of Paul's main points in Romans, as I see it, that it's impossible, nobody can observe every detail of the law of Moses as found in those 5 books without messing up.
Yeah. It's interesting that he turns back to the basis of the Mosaic Law, the 10 Commandments, in what he says.
You hear the 10 Commandments reflected, don't you?
You hear them right here. Verse 21 refers to stealing, and verse 22 refers to adultery, and later to idolatry. And then
idolatry, actually takes in the first 3 of the 10 Commandments.
Right. Which are about the worship of God.
Yes.
Yeah.
The sanctity of God.
So Paul says, when it comes right down to it, you Jews who have the law, know the law, and are supposed to be teachers of the law, act like you've got some leg up over the Gentiles when it comes to salvation, and really you don't, because although you had the law, you broke the law.
Well, now, here is another subtle attack on the Pharisee approach to the law, because it is a matter with them. It is a matter of knowing the law and knowing the subtleties of the law and being able to discuss them and argue them and debate them. And you really are scholars of the law. And to know the law and to be able to argue the law was one thing they were very proud of. Mm-hmm. And if you could convince all the rest of the Chachamim, or the sages as they referred to them, and so that your point of view became then the established standard, mm-hmm. then you were really a great rabbi, somebody very, very important, and that's what they all were mm-hmm. Trying to do.
Mm-hmm. So there was kind of a built-in tendency to arrogance in
right.
their knowledge.
It's an arrogance of knowledge.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I just think verse 23 sums up this whole first passage so beautifully. You who boast in the law, do you dishonor God by breaking the law?
There is the impossibility of living up to the standards of the law.
Right. By the way, the word break there is the word trespass, which we see sometimes in the writings of Paul.
You trespass the law.
Yeah, it's a metaphor that he uses. We know what trespassing is.
That's going where you're not supposed to go.
Going where you're not supposed to go, yeah. So he says,
Get off
you've
the grass.
got the law, right? Keep off the grass. You've got the law, but then you trespass by abandoning the law. So you have a path, you have the Torah, the path, the way you're supposed to walk.
Yeah, yes.
If you trespass, then you're veering.
You know, here's another rabbinical principle. As a matter of fact, these very people were very concerned about protecting Jewish people and one another from violating the law mm-hmm. by, as they put it, building fences. That's their language. Mm-hmm. You build a fence to the law. And what are you doing? Well, if you're supposed to say a particular prayer by noon, then you announce that the law really is you have to say that prayer before 10 a.m. Because if a person comes rushing in trying to meet the 10 a.m. deadline and you don't quite make it, you still have not violated the real law, mm-hmm. which is noon. Now, that's just a made-up example of what a fence is. But Jesus condemned fences mm-hmm. on the grounds that what you're doing is making the law impossible for the average Jew to keep. Mm-hmm. And you're inserting the commands of men in place of the commands of God. And is he talking about fences here? Paul was very aware of fences
sure.
and what that whole methodology, you know. Mm-hmm. So is that what he's saying? You've made not only is the law itself near impossible to keep, mm-hmm. but when you add the fences to it, it really has become super impossible to keep.
You know, I'd never thought of it before, but I wonder if that mentality is partly what lay behind the thinking of the Judaizers. Because the Judaizers were Christians. They had come to faith in Jesus Christ as their Savior. But it's almost like because of this fence concept, they were afraid to put their confidence in the saving death and victorious resurrection of Jesus Christ.
Right.
They thought maybe we ought to do a couple of extra things just to make sure we're saved. And so they said, well, let's circumcise. Let's keep the Mosaic law.
Right.
I don't know if that was part of their thinking.
Well, there's another part of their thinking, and that is that those who don't live under the law are violating the meaning of the law. Mm-hmm. And So we want them to be acceptable to God because they're idolatrous, they practice improper dietary laws and sexual laws and all the rest, and that's going to drag the church down into the muck and the mire. So we want them to live by the standards of the law of Moses, and that way then they will be more pleasing to Christ in the world and set a higher standard. That may have been a part of their thinking too.
And Paul rejected that just as quickly as he rejected Jewish legalism.
Because it's putting law above Christ.
Right.
And you can't do that.
Well, this whole section is wrapped up in verse 24 with a fascinating quotation from the book of Isaiah. The way it appears in...
Is it a quotation?
Well, it's a paraphrase.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, Paul didn't have iPhones that allowed him to look up Bible verses. And so he's working from memory, and he does really very well, I think.
And it's interesting to me that he is using here essentially a shortened version of the Septuagint, or the Greek Old Testament.
Which makes sense, because Paul is circulating now in a realm where Greek is the predominant language. So many of the Christian
the
converts,
learned language, I guess you'd say.
Many of the early Christians would be more familiar with Greek than with Hebrew. And so the Bible of the early church really was this Greek translation of the Old Testament.
And they seemed at liberty to kind of remember it from memory and state it that way. Sometimes it's not precisely the same wording that we have in the copies of the Septuagint available to us now.
But
and this is really a good example of that.
But the meaning is preserved. It says, God's name is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. That's a fascinating
and because
statement.
Of you is the key in that statement.
It is. And it brings us back to the whole covenant concept that we saw back in Genesis 12, where God called Abraham not just so he could bless Abraham and Abraham's heirs, but so that through this covenant family, nation, all the families of the earth would be blessed. And that's what he was talking about earlier, where Jews were meant to be guides for the blind.
Right. And the blind here is a metaphor.
Right.
Meaning those who are uninformed about the higher order of things, when you understand that there is one God who is the Creator God, and the others are all fakes.
But Paul uses this verse to say to them that you have actually let God down. You have not lived up to the expectation of your role in communicating God's love and will to Gentiles.
Yes.
And so he says, you Judaizers are maybe in the same position. Now we'd better turn to the last section of this
there's something here that has to do with circumcision.
About circumcision, Now circumcision was the main outward physical symbol of their covenant relationship with God.
Paul asked Timothy to be circumcised because Timothy's mother was Jewish, father was non-Jewish, and Timothy had not been circumcised. And so Timothy was going to go with Paul into the synagogues and so forth. Titus, on the other hand, he refused to have circumcised, even though he was not a Jew. And he's making the point that it is neither circumcision nor uncircumcision that has any bearing on being a Christian.
So the non-circumcision of Gentiles was not a disadvantage in them accepting Christ, and the circumcision of Jews, on the other hand, was not an advantage. It didn't give them a head start, as it were. But there's a second point that he makes here about circumcision, and that is that although circumcision is an outward physical symbolic act, that underlying this concept of circumcision was something inward and spiritual. That's Paul's point here. Where does he get that idea?
That's from the Old Testament, and let me reel off the places where it occurs in the Old Testament, and those who want to can jot these down. For example, Jeremiah 4:4 talks about circumcision of the heart, as does Jeremiah 9:25 and 26. And then in Deuteronomy 10:16 and Deuteronomy 30, verse 6, you have the same idea in the Torah itself. But then the passage that I think is the most astounding one comes from, of all places, Leviticus. Leviticus 26:41, which goes like this. If they confess, beginning in verse 40, if they confess their iniquity and the iniquity of their fathers in their treachery, which they committed against me, and also in walking contrary to me, so that I walked contrary to them and brought them into the land of their enemies, if then their uncircumcised heart is humbled, and they make amends for their iniquity, then I will remember my covenant with their ancestors. There you in Leviticus.
Right at the heart of the Mosaic Law.
And all of its details.
Yes, and all of its regulations regarding circumcision and the day of circumcision and all of that. We see that there's something beyond the physical act of circumcision.
Now, obviously, the prophet Jeremiah calls attention, circumcise your hearts. That's more important than the physical circumcision.
Well, and that's what Paul comes right back to here.
So Paul is writing on both law and prophets in this imagery.
And that's what he comes back to in verse 29. Our translation of verse 29 begins with the word know. The Greek word there is actually even stronger than no. It's on the contrary. He says, on the contrary, a person who is a Jew is one inwardly, and circumcision is circumcision of the heart by the Spirit, not by the written code, which means the Mosaic Law. And then he climaxes it by saying that a person's praise is not from other people for being a law-abiding Jew or circumcised on the 8th day, but the praise comes from God. I've been thinking that those three things are good reminders for us Christians even today, that what we do outwardly is important. There's nothing wrong with worship, with prayer, with fasting, with tithing, with almsgiving, whatever. But unless it represents an inner commitment, there's a problem there. And
it must be from the heart.
It must be
Jesus
from the heart.
said that over and over again. It's what's in the heart. That's in the mind, in the conscience, in the will. That's really important, because everything else comes out of that.
And as Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, we don't do this to receive human approval, but God's approval.
Well, it's time for us to leave you again. And we have one more chapter in this opening section of the letter to the Romans, and we'll come back next week and we'll finish this up and then kind of make a summary of it before we move on to Paul's answer of what's going to be done about all this problem of sin, which is universal. We hope that you'll come back and be with us then, and we wish you a wonderful week in the Lord.
This has been In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson with Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible from Milligan College, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible of Milligan College. Join us again next week for another lesson from the International Bible School lesson text. This has been a production of the First Christian Church Television Ministries.